Okay, last of all, we're going to look at psychoanalysis as one of the 19th century ideologies. When you think about a person that best represents psychoanalysis, you want to think of Sigmund Freud. Here are some characteristics of psychoanalysis. Freud's research led him to highlight the role of non-rational and destructive forces in people's lives. Nietzsche celebrated these primal qualities. Freud feared them. And so his research focused on the unconscious mind, looking particularly at dreams. He explored sexuality and neurosis. He came up with this concept of the id, the superego, and the ego. So, what are the id, the superego, and the ego? In the ego psychoanalysis structure, the id is that primal instinctual reality that exists, and the superego is that part which is curbed by morality and by government and by structures of natural law. And the ego is the element that mediates between meeting those natural innate desires that people have and submitting to the governance that is created by society. Sigmund Freud, he lived from 1856 to 1939. As you can see from this photo, which this is one of the first photos that we have, he is a tobacco smoking, cigar smoking guy. He had two major publications that were single volumes, The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, and in 1904 he published The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. That being said, he wrote 24 volumes on psychoanalysis, which are the major body of his psychological works. So he's the originator of psychoanalysis. He came up with this concept of the id, the superego, the ego. He talked about the Oedipus complex, which is the desire for a mother or an amorous or even a carnal desire that is rooted in the relationship with the mom. Seduction theory is something that he came up with, the emphasis on the primal instinct. But of course, unlike Nietzsche, he feared and he felt like that needed to be governed by some sort of moral controls, by the superego. And then he was supportive of religions to morally norm society because of this investiture in the superego. In his interpretation of dreams, he says, it is essential to abandon the over-evaluation of the property of being conscious before it becomes possible to form any correct view of the origin of what is mental. In Lip's words, the unconscious must be assumed to be the general basis of psychical life. The unconscious is the larger sphere, which includes within it the smaller sphere of the conscious. Everything conscious has an unconscious preliminary stage, whereas what is unconscious may remain at that stage and nevertheless claim to be regarded as having the full value of a psychical process. The unconscious is the true psychical reality. It is, in its innermost nature, it is an much unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it is as incompletely presented by the data of consciousness as is the external world by communication of our sense organs. Now, when we talk about psychoanalysis, it's helpful to look at some other genres of history to help us understand the influence and the importance of psychoanalysis in 19th century ideology. And there's probably no better place to turn, but in the development of literature, you have George Eliot. George Eliot was the pseudonym for the author Marianne Evans. Marianne Evans lived from 1819 to 1880, and she was the kind of novelist that did an exceptional job of helping character development take shape through entering into the interior life of the character. And so she understood the psyche of each of her characters and had well-developed psyches that it demonstrated their desires, their motivations, their feelings, and she invited readers into the minds of her characters to explore and to see the richness psychologically that was there by all of her characters. In 1851, she was the assistant editor of the Westminster Review. In 1854, she started a very open, adulterous relationship with George Henry Lewis, who was already married. In 1857 through 1858, Scenes of a Clerical Life was her first publication under the name George Eliot. And then in 1860, she published The Mill on the Floss. And in 1871 to 72, you have The Middlemarch. And by these 1857 and 1858 and 1871 to 72 dates, these are serial publications that are taking place in a periodical that then become collected together and published as a singular novel manuscript. In 1880, she marries John Cross. And of course, her major contributions is a sense of realism and the deep psychological insight. Martin Amis and Julia Barnes have both said in regards to Middlemarch that it is the greatest novel in the English language. Here's some clips about one of our characters in Middlemarch. His name is Mr. Cassabone, and he was a highly intellectual, pastoral figure that thought that he was going to be a well-published theologian and practical, ministerial, pious writer. And it has to do with this whole section has to do with his finding a spouse that is going to be a fit helpmate for his work and his profession. And you see the narcissism and the arrogance and the pride of this man as this description comes across, and his feelings of how this person is going to meet all of his desires and his needs. And of course, she's going to win out because she's going to have a powerful mind and a powerful husband, in which she would be married to him. I'm going to encourage you to go back and read this later. But I think that having read this will give you a lot of insight and helpful understanding of how psychoanalysis and the developments of psychology as they take place are going to be extreme shapers of thought life and of the individual and of 19th century culture and world as it continues to progress in the later parts of the 19th century and on into the 20th century. So that go ahead and ends this lecture. I encourage you to study hard for the exam, and I hope that you do well.